I will now call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 58 of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting takes place in a hybrid format. I would like to remind participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed through the chair. I would also ask members to raise their hands if you wish to speak, whether in person or via Zoom. The committee clerk and I will do our best to maintain the order of speakers. In keeping with Standing Order 108.2 and the motion adopted by the Subcommittee on 24 September 2024, the Subcommittee is beginning its study on forced migration patterns in different regions of the world. I would like to welcome our witness, Christina Clark-Kazak, Professor, School of Public and International Affairs, University of Ottawa. Welcome, Professor. You will be given a maximum of 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will proceed with a series of questions. Welcome, Ms. Clark-Kazak. I invite you to make your opening statement of no more than 5 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members, for the invitation. I will be giving my opening statement in English.
Brief overview of the context and then highlight 2 human rights issues that require urgent attention: the right to seek asylum and ageism. I understand that UNHCR colleagues will brief you more fully on the global statistics and demographics of forced migration, so I'll not repeat those now. Instead, I wish to highlight 3 global trends. First, internal displacement makes up the majority of forced migration, but is too often overlooked. Because internally displaced persons are citizens, they should benefit from the same legal rights and protections as other citizens. The guiding principles on internal displacement point to applicable human rights and humanitarian law. However, country visits by the UN Special Rapporteur regularly highlight human rights concerns. For example, Sudan has over 10 million internally displaced persons who face severe risk of famine and grave human rights violations, including reports of gang rape as a weapon of war. Second, the vast majority of forced migration occurs in low and middle income countries of the global south, where scarce financial resources already jeopardize the realization of basic human rights to housing, food, education, health, etc. Third, forced displacement situations are often protracted, lasting years and in some cases decades. For example, the sprawling Dadaab refugee camps in Kenya have existed since 1991. Babies are born, people get married, they grow old and die in refugee and displacement camps around the world, temporary structures that become permanent homes. Forced migration is too often treated as an emergency, humanitarian, and short-term. We need more longer-term, rights-based planning. A case in point is temporary protection accorded to Ukrainians in both Europe and Canada that was limited to just 3 years, and of course the conflict goes on. The universality of human rights applies to all people everywhere, but forced migration contexts create human rights gaps. I'd like to draw the committee's attention to 2 worrying global trends. First, the right to seek asylum is under threat. This right is enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, and domestic law, including Canada's Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. However, countries are increasingly closing their borders to people seeking refugee protection. The March 2023 amendment to the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement is one such example. The expansion of this agreement to the entire land border, including internal waterways, severely limits the ability of people to make a refugee claim in Canada. Another example is the Pakistan government's plan to forcibly repatriate Afghan refugees in violation of the principle of non-refoulement. Some of these Afghan refugees are awaiting resettlement to Canada, which required them to cross into Pakistan. Second, generalized responses to forced migration overlook the specific lived experiences of displacement. A person's ability to exercise their rights is impacted by their positionality in relation to gender, social age, disability, race, religion, and class. My research focuses on age discrimination, so I'll highlight here two worrying human rights issues that demonstrate widespread ageism in forced migration policy and programming. First, the lack of systematic birth registration in situations of displacement is a serious human rights issue. Under Article 22 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, all children have the right to birth registration. Birth certificates provide proof of legal identity, which is necessary to securing other rights. However, many children born in displacement contexts are denied the right to birth registration. Some countries only allow fathers to register births, do not recognize children from same-sex relationships, and/or require marriage certificates. For example, many Syrian refugees in Jordan cannot legally register their children's births because the Jordanian state does not recognize traditional Islamic marriage, so their children are deemed to be born out of wedlock. At the other end of the life course, older people are underrepresented in forced migration policy, programming, and research. They are more likely to remain behind in their country of origin due to physical barriers to movement or emotional attachments to their lands, homes, and communities. Those who cross international borders face particular linguistic, physical, and social barriers to accessing services and exercising their rights. For example, Ukraine has been called the oldest humanitarian crisis in the world because of the large number of older people affected by violence, human rights, and displacement. In conclusion, people in situations of forced migration are human beings with human rights. I urge the Government of Canada to uphold its international and domestic obligations to the right to asylum. I also recommend social age analysis of all forced migration policies and programming to ensure rights-based approaches to displacement across the life course. Merci beaucoup. Au plaisir de répondre à vos questions.
Thank you very much. I will be pleased to answer your questions. Thank you very much for those excellent remarks.
The debate for a question, and we would like to start with the first round of questions with Ms. Anita. You have the floor for 7 minutes, please. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. We didn't have other witnesses online? One witness. Okay. Well, I appreciate very much that you're here, and of course, recognizing that you're from the University of Ottawa and being a local MP, I'm quite proud to have you here as well. I'd like to delve a little bit more into what you said about positionality. And I know that your research, of course, is on age, but we know that for women who are in these situations of forced migration, the reality is very different than it is for others. And you touched upon the sexual violence, but I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about the particular violence, the particular barriers that women face when they are being displaced, and what are some ways in which that can be overcome, the rights of women.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So as you highlight, gender-based violence is a major issue in displacement context because often they're happening also in context of widespread human rights abuses and violence. So this is a context in which many rights are being violated, including women's rights. I think the other thing, again, I focus on age, and one of the aspects that's really interesting and problematic is when women are displaced and are pregnant. The issue of giving birth and access to those kinds of services, and also the care for the newborns. And so this is one issue that I think requires immediate attention. And I would also highlight, as you mentioned, sexual violence not just against women, but also gender diverse individuals. And this is a problem that's rooted in human rights violations, disproportionate power relations, and the fact that there are spaces in which protections, generally speaking, are not being protected. And so this is where there needs to be more specific funding and programming, but there also needs to be more attention to gender when we're planning, for example, latrines, or the way in which spaces of displacement are organized, and especially for kinds of activities like collecting water or fetching firewood, which tend to be quite gender-based. Women and girls need to be systematically asked about these kinds of issues, and so that their needs and rights can be taken into account when that programming is happening.
Thank you Thank you very much. And I also wanted to talk about the rights of children, and obviously that's a particularly vulnerable age group, but especially unaccompanied minors or minors who are in the course of the migration journey separated, forcibly separated from whatever parental figure they may have. And we've seen that in our own hemisphere. If you could talk a little bit about, and this is a human rights committee, so we're looking particularly at what Canada can do further on human rights internationally in order to ensure that the rights of children are being respected when they are in these situations.
Yeah, so the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most widely ratified, as you know, human rights instrument. Only the U.S. has not signed it. And so because of that, it actually has enormous power. And I think that we can use that because it's not just Canada saying people should uphold children's rights. It's actually everyone in the world who's agreed to these rights. In terms of separated children, so as you mentioned, there's a distinction between separated children who have maybe been temporarily displaced without their families. So, for example, they were at school and then there was a displacement that happens and then they are not displaced with their families, or unaccompanied minors who actually are crossing borders by themselves, sometimes in the company of other young people. So they're not always necessarily alone. There's siblings or cousins who sometimes cross borders. There's specific protection concerns because they're under 18, so they're protected by the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But the reason why they need protection is because there are these power relations with adults who are in some cases, going to exploit them. And it's particularly, you mentioned gender before, it's particularly the case for women or girls and gender diverse young people that are particularly at risk of trafficking and sexual exploitation. In Canada, for example, trafficking is primarily a domestic issue. It primarily happens between provinces, and it's shown that, in fact, women and gender diverse individuals are much more likely to be trafficked. And if they have come into Canada, for example, Ukrainians came to Canada with temporary visas. So there's a distinction between the airlines, which designate unaccompanied minors as under 16, and the international legal realm, which designates unaccompanied minors as under the age of 18. So we have this protection gap where young Ukrainians were arriving in Canada with visas. So, the airline didn't turn them away. But once they arrived here, there was no systematic programming for them. And the situation of Ukrainians, I think, was helpful in the sense that it shed light on the issue. There was a study that was commissioned by the Government of Canada, but in fact, all unaccompanied minors face very similar issues. Because of the differences between the provinces, we don't have a systematic way of addressing unaccompanied minors in Canada. And as you mentioned, in the Southern Hemisphere, we have even more unaccompanied minors who are fleeing violence, but also in some cases because of economic reasons. So if we think of Venezuela, for example, in some cases people are moving to other countries for economic opportunities that are not available to them elsewhere.
Mr. Chair, do I have time? Yes. On that, just because our committee is more focused not on the domestic, but on international situations, what tools does Canada have in order to ensure that the rights of these minors, for whatever reason that they're traveling unaccompanied, other than the Convention on the Rights of the Child, are there specific tools or policies that we would be able to pursue that would protect these very vulnerable children?
So I do think also that our colleagues at UNHCR have developed very helpful guidelines on unaccompanied minors, and perhaps Michael can speak to that later. Also Save the Children. I would say also that Europe is much more advanced in terms of tools and policies for unaccompanied minors because they receive many more unaccompanied minors in their borders coming through the Middle East. And so there's been much more work done in the European Union and also in the UK on this issue.
Okay. Do I have?
Yeah, thank you. Now we would like to go to Mr. Lake, please. You have the floor for 7 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the witness. Just several notes here from, sorry, I'm going to mute my, my speaker here because it might be causing problems for the speaker there. First question I had was regarding your comment about the lack of systematic birth registration. You clearly identified the problem, but how do we resolve? What suggestions do you have to resolve that problem in some of the situations, the really difficult situations that you're talking about? What can Canada do in terms of our policy to help facilitate a solution to that problem?
So the first thing I would say is diplomacy, because in some cases, again, it's another state that is not recognizing the birth because of the gender and other issues that I mentioned. The second thing I would say is practicality, so funding through development assistance. As I mentioned, the majority of displacement happens in low and middle income countries. So in some of these countries, they don't even have the resources to register their own citizens, let alone people who are coming in displacement context. So that could be another practical way. And the third thing I would say is advocacy around this issue. Because I think that in some cultures and countries, it's not a regular thing to register children. It's not recognized as being important, but it is fundamental to them to being able to exercise all their other rights. And in some cases, it leads to children being stateless. So Rohingya refugees, for example, in Bangladesh are systematically stateless because they're not recognized by either Bangladesh or Burma. And so in this case, the advocacy and diplomacy to convince those states to actually register the children.
You mentioned seniors and the unique challenges faced by seniors. Have you done any work looking at at people with disabilities, intellectual developmental disabilities maybe in particular, but all disabilities?
Yes, so there is some really great work that's done by Rachel McNally at Carleton on people with disabilities in displacement contexts. UNHCR also has policies, particularly on disabled people in displacement contexts. And in some cases, as you mentioned, there's an intersection between age and disability. So older people might also be disabled. And so there are some policies on that in terms of the older people. HelpAge and UNHCR have specific guidelines that are on older people that also include issues around disability.
And I imagine there's an intersection around the registration component or information component related to identifying people who might be vulnerable because they have autism, like I have a son with autism, right? It would be really easy to lose Jaden in a system where he can't identify himself. Right, so someone would have to make the effort to identify that there's somebody with autism who wouldn't be able to put up their hand or apply for, for some type of status or paperwork to move in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. So as you mentioned, there's this intersection between disability and often age. So depending on the age of the individual and other factors. And this is where, as you mentioned, there needs to be the diagnosis. And this really happens on the ground with mostly non-governmental organizations and UN agencies, and it often happens mostly with children. So I think where the gap is that you're identifying here is adults and older people who might have disabilities, because they're often, they're more likely to fall through the cracks, because with children there are specific child protection components that then they're being assessed, especially for education and other reasons.
Can I ask, we're studying forced migration, and it's a term that we use, forced migration. We talk like we all know exactly what forced migration is. I don't know what the definition, what would be forced migration is. Are all refugees moving considered to be forced into migration, or is there a specific category that forced migration refers to?
So generally speaking, forced migration is a broader conceptual category that would include refugees, including internally displaced people who do not cross an international border, including refugee claimants or asylum seekers who don't yet have their refugee claim, and also including people who are displaced for environmental or economic reasons, which would not be considered refugees under the UN Convention, but are clearly displaced involuntarily because of disasters, natural disasters, or human rights abuses. So it's a very broad term, and refugees would be a subcategory of that, and refugees have a specific legal status under the UN Refugee Convention and under domestic law for IRPA would be in Canada.
So important clarification would be that it's not people who are moving because of force. They might be forced by an environmental situation, earthquake or something like that, as opposed to civil unrest or war.
Yeah, I think the main issue here is the involuntariness of it.
Yeah.
So people wouldn't be choosing to move, but they have to because of environmental disaster or human rights abuses or those kind of things.
So just one last question, just in regards to, you were talking about situations where internal displacement, protracted situations. Is there a point at which, definition-wise, you could have a refugee camp in a country that's at war? The country eventually is no longer at war, but the refugees wind up staying in the situation they're in, and maybe it's not a refugee situation anymore. Maybe it's just a poverty situation because there's no longer the same thing happening that forced them into that camp in the first place. Is there a point at which someone who is an internally displaced refugee becomes not a refugee but still living in the same circumstance that they were in as a refugee?
So generally speaking, refugees in the global south do not get citizenship. So unlike in Canada, they're always going to be a foreign national in that country.
But if you're internally displaced?
So if you're internally displaced, yeah, they're not refugees then. They're internally displaced persons.
They're forced migrants, I guess, in a sense.
Exactly.
But not, okay.
And because they're citizens, sometimes they'll just make their home in a new place. And as you say, they're no longer considered to be internally displaced.
Okay. But it's still a refugee camp. It's still considered a refugee camp within the same country they're from,
It would
right?
be considered to be a displacement camp, internal displacement camp, not a refugee camp. But generally speaking, no, they're not going to continue to be in a camp. They'll move into longer-term housing and other kinds of permanent solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Monsieur Bernard-Dessert, à vous la parole pour 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Professor, for being here with us today for this important study. First, to set the table, based on all your studies and expertise, what are the human rights that are most often trampled on when you talk about human rights when they're trying to migrate and find themselves in refugee camps? I think that would depend on the legal status. If you're a citizen and you're internally displaced, these would be rights that would be rights to housing, for instance, or that type of right. But if the person is displaced across international borders, then you're talking about all the series of the human rights that has been trampled on, including the right to asylum, because there are countries, including Canada, that tries to make known what that right is of asylum. So can you give us an example? So let's say an agreement with a third party. You're trying to warn people before they're coming to Canada with regard to putting in their asylum demand. You have covered a number of conflicts. You have studied numerous waves of migration, and I'm a Quebec sovereigntist. And Canada is not a military might, nor is it a huge economic might. Globally, but it has traditions for protecting human rights. Would you agree with me that Canada's image has somewhat paled in recent years? Do you feel that Canada has a lesser impact today compared to the past? I think that for settling refugees, we've always done a good job there. But in terms of asylum rights, I think that we are diminishing our contribution in that regard. But I must underscore Canada's work for helping and educating other countries for processing asylum requests, because here we have a good system for processing that, and we are training other countries in that regard, especially in Latin America. I have another question. It might appear more domestic because I know we're talking about international human rights, but this in regard to international conventions. Recently, there was a debate here in Canada between some politicians who stated that we should displace people who have already put in their asylum request here and move them to other Canadian provinces. Would this not run counter to international conventions Canada has signed? Yes, it could. It could go against human rights. And we saw that with the closure of Roxham Road. We had sent people to the Maritimes, and in the Maritimes, there's very few lawyers available to help people put in their asylum requests. So it is a possibility. It all depends. What is clear is that everyone has the freedom of movement. You cannot stop someone from moving from one part of Canada to another. So even if you're going to send people to Newfoundland, for instance, you can't, force them to come back to Ottawa. But you could encourage people with certain measures, maybe with easier access to housing or easier access to employment, correct? All right, you've talked about Ukraine in your opening statement. I've talked with a number of organizations defending migrants, and maybe, there's been a lot of media attention. I mean, we have a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and everyone agreed you have to help Ukrainians in times of war. But we might not have, had all the information compared to, say, what's happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm not saying that they're good migrants and bad migrants, but I've been told there is less media attention in regard to Ukraine compared to other situations elsewhere in the world. All human beings have the same human rights, and yet you have very different responsibles depending on crisis, say Ukraine, Gaza, Congo, and so forth. And that's because immigration policies are influenced by domestic policy. And on the issue of Ukraine, there was a political consensus that something needed to be done. So I would encourage you to arrive at a similar political consensus when it comes to other crises, because we do need responses for the Sudan and the Congo. Right now, we have high migratory rates. In the news, you hear a great deal about migration movements in South America or Brazil, moving right through Central America, through Mexico to the United States. Can you talk about some of the dangers that migrants encounter along that route? So these are the undocumented migrants. So they are vulnerable. As you've said, this is a context where, rights can be infringed on. There's a lack of security, rights to education, to housing, and these kids do not attend school, which is a right. So these are situations that require hemispheric responses. We need to work together to find solutions. It's in our own backyard, and Canada is doing very little to resolve that problem. In your opinion, at this time, in terms of policies, are there countries with which it's easier to work with when it comes to the protection of migrants? And I'm talking here of this route from South America right through to the United States. Is it easier to work for with Colombia or, say, Costa Rica? Well, your time is out. So we do have leaders like Colombia. They've been working a lot on internal displacement, but of course they get Venezuelan refugees. So there's a good example where we can draw some lessons. Thank you.
7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really want to thank the witness for her incredible testimony so far and the work that she's doing. I guess my first question to you, Ms. Clark-Kozak, is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees had produced an education report in 2024 and recently reported that almost half of the world's 14.8 million school-aged refugee children are not in school, which is obviously deeply alarming. We know that children first, that education is a fundamental human right, and quality education is a powerful tool for shaping positive outcomes for children. What can the international community do to speed up progress in increasing education enrollment for child refugees? And, specifically, how can Canada help lead?
Thank you for the question. So I think that it's really important here to recognize that when we're talking about the right to education, as I mentioned earlier, we have more than 70% of the world's displacement in countries of the global south that already are very poor. And so one way in which Canada can contribute is to finance primary and secondary and tertiary education in those contexts. And in many cases, in cases that I've been in Uganda, for example, education is provided for both locals and refugees in the same schools. So this is a good way of actually helping to bring together the development and the humanitarian sides, so that in fact both nationals and refugees are benefiting. Because in some cases, if you provide better education for refugees, this then causes problems with local populations who are also poor and don't have access to education. So that's one thing, the resources. And I would also just clarify for the committee, as you probably already know, in many contexts, secondary school is not free. Even local children are not being able to access secondary education. And so this, a financial support would be one thing. The second thing I would also say is when we look at the stats on children in school in displacement contexts, there is a disparity between boys and girls. Girls are not going to school because they're expected to do domestic and caregiving responsibilities, but also because there's widespread sexual violence in schools, including by educators. So this is an area where there needs to be more advocacy and more sensitization around the rights of women and girls in these contexts. So I would say those would be two practical means in which Canada could encourage more education within these contexts.
Thank you. At the last meeting of this subcommittee, we received, an update on the situation in Sudan, and one of the witnesses spoke about the difference in Canada's response to the conflicts in Sudan and Ukraine, in terms of how we accept people that are being displaced. Mr. Diamond from the Royal Wallenberg Center for Human Rights noted that not a single Sudanese displaced person had been resettled since the launch of a financially burdensome program in February that was capped at 3,250 people, was released by the government. Now, he compared that to the approval of nearly 1 million people under an emergency family reunification program for Ukraine that required no eligibility or financial requirements. And Mr. Diamond stated, quote, that this widely disparate response to the war in Ukraine and to Sudan is a scandal of the first order and can only be explained by a discriminatory and frankly racist implementation of policy towards communities fleeing conflict, end quote. Do you believe there is systemic racism in Canada's refugee intake policies? And if so, what can be done to ensure Canada implements inclusive policies in this area?
So yes, there's definitely systemic discrimination within the context, and the previous speaker has also referred to this in terms of the disparities in the responses. I think that we also need to recognize, however, that the program for Ukrainians was a temporary visa program. It was not a permanent resettlement program, whereas the Sudanese program is a resettlement program. It's a program that's bringing people permanently here. That being said, I agree with you that it's unfair to place the burden on families who already are working, in many cases, lower wage jobs in Canada, and then need to find the funds in order to rescue their families to come over from Sudan, and that we should also be opening up a government-assisted refugee program, and we should also be considering temporary visas, as we did for Ukrainians, for other displacement contexts, because currently the only other context where we're considering this is Gaza. So we think about other protracted conflicts in other places, and we could be thinking about a humanitarian visa, which would allow more people to come to Canada temporarily, as we did with the Ukrainians.
Can you comment on the relationship between climate change, economic inequality, and migration, and the gaps in existing international instruments? What should the international community do to fill these gaps in the years ahead, as we see, especially a change when it comes to climate, and we see the increase of undocumented migrants and displaced peoples? Maybe you can comment on that.
So climate change is definitely a huge gap in the current human rights legislation because, as I mentioned earlier, the Refugee Convention does not recognize climate refugees. It doesn't recognize people being displaced for climate reasons. The guidelines on internal displacement do, but again, those are for citizens who would already have the right to be in those countries anyway. So this is a huge gap, and I believe that we had a missed opportunity in the Global Compact on Refugees. This was a time in which the international community could have come together and could have decided to include climate as part of the issues, but it was not addressed. And I think that the reason why is because countries are worried about the number of people who will then have claims to come to Canada and other places on the basis of widening a definition of protection in this context. But climate change is here. It's real. We see you're in BC. I mean, we just saw the scenes that are happening there. And we're affected in Canada, especially Indigenous communities, but we also will be affected by people who are fleeing displacement elsewhere. And I think that we need to seriously come up with some kind of plan globally, but also nationally to address it.
Thank you, Mr. John. Now I invite Mr. Al-Ihsasi to take the floor for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and allow me to start off by thanking you, Professor Clark-Kazak, for your testimony today. My questions, if I may, I wanted to follow up on the questions that concern children, because we all appreciate full well that 50% of the world's refugees are children. And you touched on and you highlighted the challenge of lack of birth registries. So just so we can grapple with this challenge, could you share with us when there is no birth registry, when a child refugee has no papers, what are the short-term challenges and implications, and what are the long-term ones? You did touch on being stateless, which is very important, but if you could just give us a better sense as to how that impacts individuals who are refugees.
Right. So the birth registration basically provides documentation of you as a legal person. And so it has implications not only in the early stages, but also for the rest of your life. And so it does then prevent people, for example, registering for school, getting access to health care, registering to vote. So, the civil and political rights as well as the economic and social rights are all implicated by this. I would also say in the resettlement context, if a child does not have a birth certificate, then UNHCR basically has to try to approximate a birth date. And while this is helpful because it gives gives people the ability then to be resettled. The problem is that often these birth dates can be off because you have to rely on people, for example, remembering some kind of significant political or natural event. And this can have consequences for children being placed in the wrong grade. And at the other end of the spectrum, it has consequences for when people are eligible to retire, because in our society, everything is based on chronological age. And so if that chronological age is off by a few years, it can have repercussions across the life course.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. Now, Mr. Majumdar, you have the floor for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for your insightful perspectives, especially when it comes to perhaps uneven assistance for various refugee crises around the world or forced displaced crises around the world. When you think about the scale of internal displacement we're seeing in Sudan, which is arguably the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world today, you're wondering why, I would wonder why Canada has not distinguished itself in terms of how we assist those people who are being forced through dealing with forced migration issues. Why do you think there's less attention in how we lead on issues that are as significant on Sudan as we could be on other issues?
So I think there's a constellation of factors. First of all, domestic politics. So in the case of Ukraine, we have a large Ukrainian-Canadian constituency, the largest diaspora outside of Russia and Ukraine. And so this then means that there were people here who advocate and who talk to you as MPs and to other people to try to get action on the issue. I think the second thing is foreign policy objectives. So Canada will have different foreign policy objectives, and immigration is one of a suite of foreign policy objectives, and development assistance in cases of internal displacement, for example, will also be part of that package. And thirdly, I would say there's a kind of fatigue, a compassion fatigue that generally around the world, after people hear again and again of different crises, there's varying levels of public support for that. And this is imbued, I think, with racism, with expectations of certain areas of the world. And we saw this even in the news reports, right? People were shocked that, white Ukrainians were being displaced because they looked like us, whereas in other parts of the world there's an expectation that there will be crises. And I think that this is, a huge problem in terms of public education, but also in terms of the media portrayals of what's happening around the world.
I think I've hit my 2 minutes.
Monsieur Brunel Duceppe, 2 minutes, à vous la parole.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier, I heard you say that the United States had not signed the convention. This was the Convention for the Rights of the Child. They believe that if children have rights, it would diminish parental rights. Did Canada sign the convention? Yes, all countries except for the United States. If that's the case, how is it possible, in your opinion, you're an expert in forced migration and ageism, how is it possible? How do you explain that Canada has signed an agreement with safe third country agreements, and this with a country that has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child? How could Canada sign an agreement with a country? It is because in that agreement with the United States, there's an exception for non-accompanied children. So Canada could explain to some extent that because of that exception, they've signed the agreement, although it doesn't apply to other children, including children who have parents. And one of the problems with the United States is that the policies against migrants is much more severe. Yes, you have children who are detained in the United States and separated for their parents, although here in Canada as well. So non-accompanied children need to be able to get to the border to be able to put in an application in Canada. Yes, and they have to be exempted to have that right.
Yeah, how do you think rising anti-immigration sentiment is impacting refugee policy globally?
Definitely rising anti-immigration sentiment here in Canada and around the world, and this has had an impact on all immigration categories, but particularly refugees, because the problem is the public opinion of refugees is that they're a drain on the public purse. This is not actually empirically true, but this is the public perception. And so when you have a rise in anti-immigration, you have also a backlash against these humanitarian programs, and it's hugely problematic, and it can turn violent, as we saw in the UK during the summer. There were riots that were against immigrant communities in the UK that were very violent.
What recommendations would you make to politicians to combat the anti-immigration sentiments that are happening when it comes to refugee policies and of course, the disinformation that's being spread?
I think, first of all, we have to be very careful about the words that we use. For example, there is a widespread use of the term, quote unquote, illegal immigrant, and that actually is empirically not true. People have there might be an administrative law that's infracted if people cross a border informally, but there's no such thing as an illegal immigrant. And so this kind of discourse actually criminalizes people, and then that gives the public sort of this idea that, in fact, there's a problem here. I think the other thing is that, and I know this because of work by colleagues at Laval University, that you as MPs work very hard in your constituencies to solve immigration issues. And I think this needs to continue to be done, and need to talk to everyday people about the fact that immigrants are human beings, and that they're also protected by the Charter. So in Canada, everyone is protected by the Charter, including non-citizens.
Agreed, 100%. How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
It's over. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your presence with us. Thanks for your answers. It enlightened all members of the company. We deeply thank you, and now we regret. We wish you all the best. Et maintenant, je suspends pour la deuxième période de notre réunion. Merci. Ouvre maintenant la séance.
I would like to welcome our next witnesses, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Michael Casasola, Senior Administrator for Resettlement and Complementary Measures, and Ms. Azadeh Tamjidi, Senior Legal Advisor. You'll be given a maximum of 5 minutes for your statement, after which we'll proceed with a series of questions. Welcome, Mr. Casasola and Ms. Tamjidi. I would invite you to make your opening statement of no more than 5 minutes. Madame Tamjidi or Mr. Casasola, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee for inviting us. I'm here on behalf of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UN Refugee Agency. We work to protect people forced to flee their homes because of conflict and persecution in more than 130 countries. Let me begin by setting the scene. As of the end of June, protracted and emerging crises have driven global displacement to a staggering 122.6 million people worldwide. That's 3 times the population of Canada. The numbers have almost doubled since a decade ago and show no signs of slowing down. These figures do not capture the hundreds of thousands of people who have been recently displaced in Lebanon, nor the further 400,000 people who have crossed into Syria from Lebanon, or the thousands of displaced Israelis. At the same time, away from the headlines, we are facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent history in Sudan. Conflict has displaced more than 8 million people inside the country. We're also approaching 3 million refugees in neighboring states. The situations in Lebanon and Sudan are just 2 examples of the current challenges we're facing. 2/3 of forcibly displaced people originate from just 10 countries, including Ukraine, Myanmar, Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Venezuela. The statistics are staggering, but behind the numbers are people, mom, dads, students, toddlers, seniors, ordinary folks whose lives have been torn apart. Yet the world's response remains deeply unequal. Most refugees remain in neighboring countries, many of which are low or middle income nations already facing their own challenges. The effect of climate change have further compounded the crisis, with 70% of refugees in 2022 coming from climate vulnerable countries, an increase from 56% 10 years earlier. As displacement rises, the resources available to respond have not kept up. This year, our operations are only 45% funded, creating a critical shortfall that severely impacts our ability to respond to an increasing number of emergencies. Cutting essential services has become inevitable. Those who depend on us for life-saving support are suffering the most. And yet, despite the somber picture, the right policies, attitudes, and support can bring positive change, and this is where we turn to you. For decades, the UN Refugee Agency has relied on Canada for leadership and support in meeting these global challenges. Canada continues to be a top donor to the UN Refugee Agency. It is a partnership we value and hope to grow to keep up with needs. Canada has also been a leading resettlement country and a model in pioneering new legal pathways for refugees. Both globally and in Canada, we're witnessing a rise in the number of people seeking asylum. Canada's established itself as a global leader in asylum by maintaining a fair, efficient, and robust system for many years. At the same time, we would like to thank Canada for its support to countries in the Americas to strengthen their asylum systems. Canada regularly shares best practices and provides financial support to strengthen asylum systems in countries such as Mexico and Costa Rica. In closing, we would like to thank the committee for your interest in how Canada can best respond to the rise of forced displacement. It is a shared global responsibility, and addressing it is only possible through a global solidarity translated into action. This requires determined political will and financial support. It includes addressing the root causes of conflict, creating conditions for refugees to return home in safety and dignity, helping them integrate into their countries of refuge, and expanding access to third country solutions. This will not be easy, but Canada has proven it has the fortitude and commitment to make a real difference for people forced to flee worldwide. We look forward to your questions and your continued support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Casasola. And now I would like to invite Madame Tamjidi to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
I have no further comments. That would be the entirety of our comments.
So thank you for your declaration. I would like now to open the floor for the questions. And we would like to start with first, Madame Pam Damoff. You have the floor for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here, and thank you to our previous witness as well for the work that you're doing on this really important issue. I wonder, I was in Costa Rica this summer and went to a migrant shelter, and one of the things that came up while I was there was the changing demographics of migrants, where it used to be single adults, and it's now largely families who are escaping and becoming migrants, and just the challenges. I was quite taken aback to see young children who had traveled with their families, and I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the demographics and how those have changed in terms of migration.
Thank you, and thank you for the drawing attention to the situation in the Americas, because often it is overlooked in terms of human displacement. I'll refer in a moment to my colleague Azadeh Tamjidi, who's been working in this area, but I just want to highlight, in addition to the reality of the makeup of families and components, it's also been the element of extra-regional movements. In addition to people coming from, for example, in Costa Rica, from Nicaragua and neighboring countries, we're also seeing a large number of movements up through South America, up through the Darien Gap, and through, making their way north. And it's created in itself a whole slew of human rights challenges, but I'll refer to my colleague.
Thank you for the question. Costa Rica is definitely an important country in terms that it is receiving quite a few asylum seekers, and their system is now looking at how to deal with the numbers that are increasing. It is true that there are more children and unaccompanied children that are now claiming in countries like Costa Rica, but the Americas traditionally has seen quite a significant number of children moving on their own throughout the region and making their way up to Mexico and then to the United States, and sometimes in some cases to Canada. So the importance for countries like Costa Rica and countries along the routes is to provide child-friendly protection services, and in terms of ensuring that those children have access to asylum and assistance as well. So it is something that we are seeing an increase of. Children are undertaking much more dangerous routes on their own now, and part of the reason for that is because parents are unable to fund the travel of the whole family. So we're seeing a lot more parents making the very difficult decision of trying to send their children to safer areas with the help of smugglers, sometimes with the help of traffickers, to make that perilous and dangerous journey up north. Now, UNHCR is responding with the help of states and governments like Costa Rica in trying to address these issues and ensuring that the rights of those children along the route are respected and they have access to services and assistance throughout the legal process that they have to go through.
Thank you. I also want to follow up on a question from the previous panel that my colleague, Mr. Johns, had asked about climate refugees. It was about 20 years ago that a Canadian author named Gwyn Dyer wrote a book called Climate Wars. And at the time, it was very prophetic in terms of how people would be displaced because of climate and the huge issues that it would cause for urban centers and for conflict. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the impact that climate is having on migration.
Thank you for the question. So in terms of climate, what we're seeing in the majority of situations is that it is exacerbating displacement, situations of displacement. We're not seeing a huge number of people at the moment crossing borders and making asylum applications because of a climate event. So what it does is make individuals who are already in a displacement situation more vulnerable. We're not seeing it as a huge cause of displacement across borders. So it's more of a situation of internal displacement at the moment.
Bangladesh.
Yeah, so in some situations you do see it impacting cross-border movements, but a large majority of the situations for now, due to climate change, are more internally displaced in the country. Now, we do see, and I recognize the question that was in the previous panel about the refugee definition and whether it would apply to those who are fleeing a climate disaster or event. We believe the refugee definition is sufficient as is. It does recognize certain situations where a climate event would exacerbate a refugee movement and could potentially see someone accepted and be looked at as a reason for accepting a person as a refugee. So, for example, if someone is being discriminated or persecuted in the distribution of humanitarian assistance because of their gender or their participation or their minority social group, in the response to a climate event, that could qualify as a refugee if they end up crossing a border and making an asylum claim. We believe states should look at larger solutions such as other forms of complementary protection when you're looking at temporary protection or broader definitions than the refugee definition, and then the refugee definition should be kept the way it is, and the law should be applied for the refugee status the way it is right now, and that states should look at broader solutions for those displaced by climate.
And I have just over a minute left. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about terminology that's used, because that often drives public opinion. And we're seeing in Canada a rising pushback on immigration and refugees and the perception. I remember it was actually several years ago, we had a gentleman testify who'd walked across the border in Emerson, Manitoba, and he was going to be outed as a gay man by his coach and chose to walk to Canada and ended up being found frozen in a field. And there was a lot of political gamesmanship being done at the time around what it is. I'm just wondering if you could talk briefly about how language impacts perception on these people that are fleeing for very valid reasons.
So definitely it has an impact when these types of conversations are done in a politicized environment. We see often when the language increases in terms of saying, let's keep certain people out, are they real refugees, are they not real refugees, are they migrants, that we see an increase in policies that are more negative and countries starting to close doors a little bit more. That's something that's definitely happening on a more prevalent basis globally. It's not just in places like Canada, but globally. And I think the way politicians and the way public servants talk about refugee issues and asylum issues is really important because it sets the narrative and the public discourse. Oftentimes, we see a lot of disinformation about who is coming and why, and who they actually are and what rights they have. So I think taking a more rights-based approach, especially in the public discourse, is very important, and being very mindful of the language that is used. And I echo our previous speaker's remarks on that as well, and definitely agree that it's important when looking at who you're defining and how you're talking about these types of populations, you're looking at their rights and you're focusing on the fact that they're human beings, because it will eventually have an impact on public opinion at large.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I would like to invite Mr. Lake to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I think your organization is interesting for folks from Edmonton. I believe that one of your global goodwill ambassadors is Alfonso Davies, who made his way to Edmonton, I believe, at 5 years old. He was born in Ghana to refugee Liberian parents, I believe.
And I think he was originally destined, he came to that, I believe the government-assisted refugee program, originally went to Windsor, but his family quickly moved to Edmonton.
Yeah, it's a good choice. Good choice, moving to Edmonton.
But I'm from Windsor, so I'm kind of
And very importantly, a huge Oilers fan as well. So, and when Alfonso Davies shows up at an Oilers game, it's a big event. So, anyways, a great Canadian success story, and of course, grew up, the community embraced him and his family, wound up having the opportunity to get involved in a soccer program for young kids that didn't have the same opportunities as everybody else in Edmonton, and huge success story. So I want to, hopefully we have more of those success stories as we work through some of these enormous challenges we're dealing with. Couple of questions. So when you're thinking about the situations that we're talking about, you talk about the massive numbers of people displaced, double what it was 10 years ago. when you're, I just want a better understanding of when people, when you make a determination that someone's, the situation is dire enough that we're going to move someone from the country they're from to another country. Because it's got to be a complicated situation, right? Because ultimately you hope that someone can remain in their country and eventually contribute to their own country. And as we take particularly young people from countries, when the country eventually overcomes whatever it's going through, they're going to miss those people, right? How do you make that determination as to when the situation's dire enough that you're going to move somebody from the country they're in? Because you're probably not doing it immediately upon displacement, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's Canada's a country of immigration, and quite often we immediately think, okay, what's the immigration response to a particular crisis? And for us, it's oftentimes when we need life-saving assistance. We're not thinking immediately about, a thing like resettlement. We've been given the mandate by the General Assembly to be responsible for the protection of refugees and to work with countries to find a solution, either return to the country they came from in safety and dignity, or basically find them a home somewhere else. Resettlement is a precious and powerful tool. Canada's been a leader in it, as it's been more recently in other what we call complementary pathways, like private sponsorship, even more recently labor mobility as a pathway. But we estimate now among the 32 million people that we define as refugees within the 122 million people are forcefully displaced, that about 2.9 million of them need resettlement. And that is looking at those people with the most acute protection problems.
Sorry, how many was that?
We estimate crudely 2.9 million.
2.9 million need displacement, or need to move, right?
Well, we'd be looking for resettlement. That being said, resettlement is a voluntary activity of states, just like the donations we rely on. It's up to how much Canada believes it can contribute towards us. It's the same thing with resettlement. So we have to start from that and try to figure out what makes the most sense. And as you can imagine, we're looking for those refugees with the most acute protection problems in the countries of asylum. So it's not just that they're a refugee, that they had to flee their country of origin, but in the country of asylum, they now have this serious protection problem. For example, we use 7 different categories, and I won't get into all detail, but just to say we look for refugees with one of the categories is legal physical protection needs, where they're facing detention, they're facing forced refoulement back to their country of origin, or they may be attacked by other refugee groups. For example, think of an LGBTQI refugee who's fled their country of origin. Now in another country, they're experiencing the same type of persecution. Survivors of violence and torture, because we don't have the psychosocial supports that we need to respond to the needs of such refugees, we may be pursuing resettlement for it, or refugee women at risk. We talked earlier about some of the challenge. Our Dr. Clark Kazak, spoke earlier about some of the gender gaps. Well, gender-based persecution is a problem, and we sometimes use the Women at Risk program to respond to that. For example, about 20% of the refugees Canada had resettled last year were refugees who came through the Women at Risk program. Those 3 categories make up the vast majority of refugees we would refer. Again, selecting from those people with the most acute protection problems. There's obviously many more refugees that could benefit from resettlement and are in need of a solution. Last year was actually a record for us. We referred to all states, not just Canada, because we work with about 26 states in terms of identifying refugees for potential resettlement. That was about 150,000 people. So when I give you, the scale of 122 million people forcibly displaced, 32 million people who are refugees under UNHCR's mandate, 2.9 million of whom we estimate are in need of resettlement, and then with the reality that we'll have about 150, 160, which is record level spaces, we have to make some very difficult choices, as you can imagine, trying to respond to that. And you're right, it's a big deal to remove from one person. It's very resource intensive to take someone from one part of the world to another part of the world. But the one thing we've seen in what's been the Canadian experience is that it's turned out to be positive in the sense that, in the one hand, it's not, it's a potential loss for the country of origin, but in reality, it's been obviously shown itself to be a benefit for Canada. The statistics demonstrate that refugees make important contributions to Canada, even though you selected them because of their vulnerability and the danger they were in, or to respond to the various problems that they had. The statistics Canada's shown, because what Canada's done well, is integrate them. And over time, we find that, those first 5 to 10 years, depending which academic you talk to, it's hard. But to be fair, what Canada does well is every year it gets better. And we see by year, you mentioned you're from Edmonton, there was a study done by, Bronwyn Bragg and Dan Hebert, a paper that they wrote recently looking at housing in the 6 largest cities in Canada. And what they found was by about somewhere after 20 plus years, refugees had a higher home ownership than Canadians in 5 of the 6 cities. The one exception was Edmonton. But every other city, refugees had higher ownership, which I don't think speaks to, housing is an issue for us in Canada right now, and I understand that, but just saying that over time we see these improvements. The access to opportunities pays off for everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Lake. Now, Monsieur Brunel Duceppe, à vous la parole pour 7 minutes.
Mr. Brunel Duceppe. Thank you, Chair. Earlier you talked about
human traffickers.
Smugglers. We've learned quite a bit about that issue through television and news stories, and we'd be interested in your expertise. There are gangs that exploit immigrants. Could you expand on this? If you'll allow me, I will answer your question in English.
Yes, smugglers and traffickers are often used by refugees and asylum seekers on the move. They definitely, at times, use them to circumvent restrictions that are often put in place to try to find safety. Now, according to the Refugee Convention, individuals, no matter which mode they enter a country, have the right to seek asylum and to seek safety. So really what we are often looking at and worried about is the exploitation and abuse of those vulnerable populations by smuggling routes or traffickers, which is a much more serious definition. If you're looking at trafficking, you're looking at the exploitation of the individual for some kind of personal gain. Whereas smuggling is looking a little bit less along the danger scale and is looking more at moving the individual or assisting the person to move either for a small amount of money, for instance, or some kind of return. But trafficking is looking at the exploitation of the individual. And that's much more serious in our criminal code and internationally than the smuggler definition. So it is definitely something that we see often. And we're seeing it go on the rise as well as countries are looking at more restrictive measures to keep people out. So as you may know, people who are desperate and who want to find safety will increasingly resort to more dangerous routes and the use of smugglers and traffickers in order to find safety.
C'est effectivement quelque chose qui est...
So this is extremely worrisome. And perhaps you will be able to explain further, but what we hear is there are more and more violent groups, Mexican cartels, for instance, that are using violent means and the trafficking of human beings. And because of migratory routes that go through their territories, and from what we understand, it gives these cartels all the more power, and more people fall into their clutches.
The actual situation. The different smuggling routes and the traffickers that are used really depend on which region of the world you're looking at, and it's hard to make a very blanket statement to confirm your question. But definitely, it is something that.
Si je peux me permettre, j'essaie de me concentrer aussi.
If you'll allow me, I'm concentrating more on the Latin America, because we hear so often about incidents. We hear about, refugees moving through Brazil and moving farther north.
I mean, this is why one of the strategies we've been employing was actually been led by the United States, but Canada's been supporting, and Spain and other countries have been working on what we're calling safe mobility offices. This initiative to try to provide access to legal immigration routes earlier in the process. right? So that instead of traveling all the way through, we set up right now, there are operations set up in Colombia, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Guatemala. And the idea is to try to assess if someone has a protection problem, to articulate it now, or there may be maybe a migrant with a non-protection driven reason. It's not being driven by persecution, but some other need. And then to try to determine if they can access available programs, such as in the United States or Canada and such. So this is a measure we're already taking. We're already into the hundreds of thousands of people who are accessing it. And so this is one way we're trying to, as I said, avoid the dangers which are so evident in, like I mentioned, the Darien Gap and other parts of the Americas.
Excusez. Et c'est là que, parce que
Earlier, you talked about, uneven responses from depending on the country of origin of the refugee, which is a problem. But when it covers so many countries in a vast territory, that may well be where Canada can play a role through agreements such as the ones you've just described with Colombia, Guatemala, and others, to try to persuade these countries to sign bilateral agreements with Canada for the settlement of refugees.
Look at it as a regional approach for the Americas. And as my colleague indicated, the Safe Mobility offices are one response, but it should be looked at as a multifaceted response. And you should study the route that people are taking, right? And look at it as an approach that's done along the route. So the Safe Mobility offices are one way to respond, and Canada could definitely encourage more countries to participate and look at programs that are similar. Another way to respond is strengthening asylum systems in the region, so to ensure that people, stopping them from moving forward, if they could access protection earlier through the asylum system of a country, that would be another way to respond and to ensure that they're not using smugglers to move more north. And definitely having more programming and supports for specifically vulnerable populations like women on the move and unaccompanied children on the move. So looking at programming along the route that goes from the south of Latin America up north.
Parce que ce qu'on me dit, et j'ai rencontré personnellement des gens qui...
I've personally met with people who have done the entire route, a woman in particular who recounted her horrid experience, especially, that the Darien Gap, Colombia, through to Panama, Venezuela, and you hear about these criminal gangs playing a big role, and these cartels or organized crime means often local corruption of authorities, and in some countries even national governmental corruption. Now, is your organization aware of this problem? And do you make that a priority? Because what I'm hearing from those who've experienced this journey as migrant, their biggest fear is to deal with those groups and the corrupt authorities.
We exceed 25 seconds.
Just to confirm, yes, we are aware that they are being used. We are aware of the situation, and we do speak to states about this issue on a very frequent basis, and we do encourage cooperation between states to address these issues and in strengthening their own systems and their own rights-based approaches. Of course, it's not always easy, but we are hoping that the situation over time, over the long term, will improve. But it is definitely something we are aware of.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, you have the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Well, first, thank you so much for your testimony. I'm very grateful for the work you do and commend you for the important work that you do. And I was very encouraged, actually, when you talked about refugees having a high success rate when it came to home ownership over the last 20 years, your study revealed. But we also know across Canada, many asylum seekers and refugees, they're living in shelters, they're in hotels, or they're unhoused. What can the federal government, and actually, do you believe the federal government is providing adequate supports to displaced persons coming to Canada in terms of housing, healthcare, and employment? And maybe you can talk a little bit about where we need to do better and what is the impact of Canada's high cost of living when it comes to newcomers as well.
Canada is definitely a country that has a great integration model and a great reception model for a lot of displaced populations. When you look at it compared to other parts of the world, it definitely has a fairly high standard. But it is true that, like other countries around the world, Canada is seeing a very, very big housing crisis that is trying to address globally. So it is not a surprise that asylum seekers are seeing an impact. And it is not a surprise at all that they are also impacted by the housing crisis. Now, there are things that Canada could look at and do better. There's always improvements that many countries can make in terms of their reception. One example is that many countries in South America are looking at models that take employment opportunities for asylum seekers and try to move them to other parts of the country where those employment opportunities exist, for instance. So those are interesting programs because it leads to better settlement of asylum seekers, and they also have a better opportunity to find housing on their own and to support themselves. So we do know if certain market is saturated in terms of having too many people in one city, if you are looking at relocating them, don't just look at relocating them based on housing availability, but look at relocating them based on employment availability and other services that would be available. So that would be something that Canada could definitely look at. But comparatively, around the world, Canada definitely has a very good system in terms of integration, settlement, and services offered to displaced populations, not just asylum seekers and refugees. And I think as a model, it is something that has a lot of things it could teach other countries around the world, which it is doing, and we encourage it to do a lot more of that.
No, just if I may add, just on Ms. Tamjidi's last point, I mean, it's routine for governments from around the world to come look at the Canadian integration model. And while Canadians wring their hands about whether we're doing a good enough job about it, it's often seen, again, as this model. Because of those outcomes, as I mentioned earlier, that it gets better for newcomers over time. The next generation doesn't plateau, but does better. We know that right now from the most recent Statistics Canada study I've seen, that refugees have a higher graduation rate in college, university, and postgraduate studies. Sorry, refugee children have a greater graduation rate in college, university, and postgraduate studies than Canadian-born. Doesn't mean that they're smarter, it just means the system works. And if you give them access to opportunities, then Canada benefits.
Would you agree, though, that, given the housing situation that we're in right now, that there is areas where we can improve, and maybe some suggestions and thoughts on that? I mean, I think the last few years, we're certainly seeing the housing crunch impacting most communities in Canada. I'd imagine that you might have seen different models around the world that Canada could look at to improve the situation.
I'll let Ms. Tamjidi respond to some of the latter parts with some ideas, but I just want to acknowledge this is a problem we're hearing from everybody. This is a problem we're hearing from all states. So this is more of a global phenomena that all countries are wrestling with. So please.
And it really depends on which populations you're referring to, right? So if you're bringing someone as a resettled refugee, they have different access to different types of services versus an asylum seeker. I'll focus my comments on asylum seeker populations. There are definitely different models globally. So certain countries, for example, have a reception center model where when the asylum seeker is going through the asylum process, they will be housed in a reception center where they would have access to legal assistance, counsel, social services, information on how to find a job, work permits, things like that, and it's all housed under one roof. So certain countries, particularly in Europe, prefer this model because they believe that it assists the individual while they're going through their asylum process and allows them to better move on from a reception center if they are accepted. So there are programs like that exist that Canada could consider looking at. There are also different models where countries focus and rely on NGOs to provide that service and provide support and funding to those NGOs that provide specific services for these populations that are very geared towards their specific needs. So it's not just a one-size-fits-all. You could also do a combinations of those different models, and I definitely invite Canada, if they do have questions about that, to come to our organization. We do have a vast array of information on the different models used globally, and there's always a mix and match of best practices that could be used.
No, I appreciate that. And there's an incredible group in my riding, the Comox Valley, that have been welcoming Ukrainians, but they haven't had any resources from the government. So it's all volunteer based almost. And they absolutely need resources to give the Ukrainians that are here the best chance possible. And so there is opportunities, I believe. In terms of, what we can do to reduce the drivers of forced migration, can you speak a little bit about that, especially in places where Canada plays a pivotal role? I think about Ethiopia, where we provide international development assistance. We have an influence. Can you maybe speak about what we can do and what role we can play in reducing the drivers of forced migration?
Half minute, please.
Sorry. Well, first would be address root causes. We are a neutral organization. We must work on both sides of the border whenever there's a conflict. We work with internally displaced, and yet on the other side of the border, we're working also with the refugee population. But we look to states to effectively address the causes of forced displacement. There are some examples Dr. Clark-Kazak referenced earlier that we could also be doing. The support for host communities in terms of integration, because refugees, for example, there's no need in setting up a education system for refugees separate from the host population. Why not support the host population with refugees being able to access it? There is also, we need to bring in new actors to help find these solutions, because at these unprecedented levels, we're looking now to the World Bank. Private sector fund donations in Canada. It's not just the government of Canada. Canadians have been a key source of support for us as an organization. About 2 years ago, we reached $1 billion in terms of donations from the private sector, which has been critically important for us.
Thank you. Now I invite Mr. Ali to take the floor for 3 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you also to the witnesses. Your testimony has certainly been very, very helpful. The first question I had is, I believe you were here in the room. From the first witness, we did hear that protocols are being developed in the EU to deal with the issue of trafficking when it comes to refugees. I was wondering if you're aware of those guidelines, protocols, and whether there is any room to apply those very same practices to the Americas as well.
Since it is very specific, I will definitely get back to the committee on that to provide the specific guidelines that we have in addressing situations of trafficked persons and the ones that are being developed by EU. So I'll do that in writing.
Okay, thanks so much. And then, Ms. Tamjidi, as I understand, you're an expert in setting up legal frameworks to deal with different streams of displaced people or refugees. So to the extent that you see the system that we have in place, are those legal frameworks responsive to what we have been experiencing in terms of increased levels of refugees over the course of the past several years?
I think here it's important to look at what legal framework you're looking at. There's a vast array of responses that Canada employs, and my colleague can definitely talk about the resettlement and the complementary pathways types of programs. When you're looking at asylum, Canada's system is fairly robust. It is a system that we often look to as an example to the world. It was developed with a certain amount of claims in mind that we would receive a year, around 50 to 60,000 claims. So the harder part right now is looking at how to make that system more flexible for a larger amount of asylum claims that we are receiving. Now, that is possible to do within the current framework, and it is possible to look at things like differentiated case processing, which basically means treating different cases and files from different countries at a different rate. Meaning taking certain cases, let's say if you have a case of Afghans who are coming and making an asylum claim, you would process their cases much faster than you would someone someone from a different nationality if their cases are more complex, for instance. And that would help you address backlogs in the system. Now, there is a lot of work being done at the government level, at UNHCR's level as well, to look at Canada's asylum system and see if it's flexible enough and if it could be, if there's tweaks that could be made. And there are always improvements, I believe, that could be made on that side. On the resettlement and complementary pathways.
I just want
Please wrap it up. Sorry, wrap it out, please.
Sorry, very quickly then. No, just to say that one of the, Dr. Clark-Kazak had mentioned the issue of potential, the different responses Canada's applied to different groups in terms of these additional special humanitarian initiatives. I'll be honest and transparent with you, what's been really key for us is that it's not been at the expense of resettlement spaces. It's not been at the expense of those additional needs I talked about earlier, and that's really been really key for us. I know that the government is working on its own crisis response framework to deal with some of these concerns, but for us, from our vantage point, it's not had that impact, which we've seen in other countries. It has impacted, so we're grateful.
Thank you. About 3 minutes. The floor is yours, please.
And thank you for taking the time to give us such a comprehensive assessment. I'd like to take a slightly different track than my colleagues have by looking more at the source of refugees. If I might ask, authoritarian regimes, as our previous colleague had testified, play a role in generating a refugee crisis, whether it's internally displaced or internationally. In your perspective, where would you say authoritarian regimes have modernized their approach in weaponizing the displacement of people as a matter of their policy?
I'm not sure. I mean, we're a UN agency having to work with all states, regardless. And so it's not for me to specifically refer to any particular state and such. As I mentioned earlier, we have to work on both sides of the border, both internally and externally. And we work in a variety of different languages and cultures and needs and such. I'm not sure, I'll be transparent with you, I'm not sure how to address that question in terms of, I mean, obviously we're always concerned that the rights and the protection of refugees be respected throughout. And I guess that would extend also to migrants and other groups. Of course, they have rights as well. But I'm not sure how to unpack that. I'll be transparent.
Well, maybe, yeah, instead of naming individual states, given the situation that the UNHCR has to operate within, let me ask broad questions. Are authoritarian states weaponizing migration as a means to destabilize other regions?
Oh, I think that's much more of a question for an academic to do much more of a perspective. I know. I'm just saying it sounds like the comments of the Secretary General or something.
Well, and I'm not at the UNHCR. You assess forced migration from a multitude of perspectives. It's okay to discuss how countries absorb and deal with those issues, whether it's in the global north, the global south, wherever it might be. But I think absent of an appreciation of where the source is coming from, the prevention that you've described as necessary to deal with this mass displacement of people, which to your tune has increased 2 times in 10 years, requires a better assessment as to why it's being accelerated the way it is.
Well, I would say that one of our, on that point, is the question of is the political will to find solutions to conflicts. The treatment of asylum seekers, we've been obviously very concerned about globally in terms of state responses and whether states are using or somehow trying to, as you say, weaponization. That's why I'm just not sure how to unpack that. But certainly we are concerned about the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers globally, period. We're concerned about the continuing to have the access to seek asylum, the principle of non-refoulement. These are important key principles. The previous speaker spoke about them, and whether or not newcomers are used as a particular tool, I can't speak yet. But I can say that we're obviously very concerned about the situation and the rising number of forcibly displaced persons and their treatment. Do you want to say anything?
I would add that internationally, we do look at protection issues that people, forcibly displaced populations are facing, right? So if you look at our global trends report, that would give you a good indication of the issues and the protection issues that our individual populations are facing.
I appreciate that. The question, the examples that come to mind that maybe I can say and you may not, is how Russia uses displaced people from one region of the world, flies them to Minsk, and then goes to destabilize Poland with it, which is documented by academics, UN personnel, and others around the world as a means of doing so. Or how Turkey has been turning on and off the pressure valve by threatening migration into Europe to destabilize European Union systems. Or in the Americas, how the forced displacement of people is being used to destabilize our hemisphere alone, as colleagues have touched upon.
Thank you, Mr. Majumdar. Quick answer, please.
No, I mean,
exceed 25 seconds.
I think I would just also have to acknowledge, though, I mean, to be fair, you give one of the examples, Turkey. Turkey hosts more refugees than any other countries in the world. And I need to also recognize some of these states do carry a tremendous amount of responsibility with that.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, you have vous avez la.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, you have the floor. 3 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you once again for being with us today. I imagine your organization has forecasts in regard to future conflicts or political situations that might give rise to additional migratory crises. Does your organization do any forecasting?
We do any public forecasting, but
Non. Okay. Pas publiquement, mais à l'interne, vous.
Internally.
Stockpiles of materials around the world so that when an emergency takes place, we'll be there. I mean, that's one of the benefits we have. While it be challenging being a large organization, the benefit is that we are everywhere. We're in 100-plus organizations,
130
countries. So we have a presence around the world, and as I said, we have various stockpiles of relief items around the world so that we can respond when events take place, including in some instances when, for example, like an earthquake has taken place and it affects the refugee population, then we will help the refugee population and the local population with that assistance.
Il y a une situation dont.
There's one situation which we don't hear enough about, unfortunately. I've been trying to raise it for some time. In my opinion, it's very concerning. You're probably well aware that in some 2 weeks, there'll be very important elections just south of the Canadian border in the United States. Right now, what we see in the polls is that the two candidates are neck and neck. And one candidate has made a public statement that they would deport millions of people. I think the figure was 10 million. Be it feasible or not, what is unfortunate is that the candidate made the statement. Are you ready after the victory of that particular candidate who will remain unnamed? Are you prepared? I mean, if you think there is going to be if you're aware of a huge number of asylum seekers, if you can imagine that the day after election there might be hundreds of thousands of people wanting to move north to the more developed countries, that is Canada. Are you ready for that?
Canada as UNHCR, but we are here to support the government. So if the government does have an increase in asylum claims for whatever reason, we would be here to support them in addressing that increase.
Mr. John, you have the floor for.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and really want to thank the witnesses again for the important work that you're doing in today's work and testimony. Right now in Lebanon, it's estimated that there are nearly 200,000 migrant workers. Many are undocumented, as we're learning as well. Can you speak about the unique challenges migrant workers face during times of conflict, like what's happening in Lebanon right now?
Thank you for drawing attention to the situation in Lebanon. We're right now in a country where there's already about 1.2 million people have been displaced inside the country. Another 400,000 plus have crossed the border into Syria, about 70% of them being Syrians. the remaining being Lebanese and some other nationalities. But we're also in a situation of displacement for ourselves in that country. I mean, many of our staff have been displaced. We have had 2 staff members killed in Lebanon and such. I think we're providing assistance to everyone in the country who's displaced. We are providing in real substandard. We are the lead UN agency, and we are, despite the challenges that our own staff are facing, we're delivering services. I can't speak to the specific situation of migrant workers. They're not under our mandate as an organization. They would be more the responsibility of the International Organization for Migration. They have rights, and they would be basically, unlike refugees, they could be expected to approach the embassy from the country from which they came for assistance.
Okay, thank you, and my condolences to you and your colleagues, and of course the families of those that have been killed in this terrible conflict. Do you believe that the Global Compact on refugees and the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration are achieving their goals? And maybe you can identify some of the gaps that are still needed to be addressed in international policy, such as climate change that you touched on a little bit earlier.
Thank you for the question. And I can't comment on the Global Compact on migration because I'm just not familiar. Again, I'd have to refer to the International Organization for Migration. On the Global Compact on refugees, we are seeing results. We are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, new actors getting involved. It has managed to get, trying to build support for the countries that are hosting most of the refugees. So it's really encouraging to see a number of new pledges, the number of new states involved. That being said, obviously, there's further we could go. And obviously, we could require more could be done. We are seeing also, in addition to the number of pledges, we actually have to ensure that states actually and other actors who made pledges, because it's not just states, fulfill those pledges. So the first step is getting states to agree to take action, to provide additional assistance and such. But the second is actually then for that to be implemented. Do you want to add further?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Jones. Here I would like to comment on something, Mr. Casasola. I seize this opportunity. Lebanon is my natal country, and I would like you to be more vigilant in providing humanitarian aid and services. I come from northern Lebanon. In my small town of northern Lebanon, there is 85 families for 3 weeks now. They receive zero at the humanitarian. In many villages, the same thing. So do not concentrate only on the city. Go for other part of the country. Thank you. I would like to thank both of you for being here, for your testimony. It was very interesting to hear you. And if you would like to share more information with the committee, you could always write to the clerk. Thank you, and wish you all the best. Excuse me, just to say bye. Thank you.